So here are the electronics and the parts that we're going to use to build the DISON X. This is gonna be a 3" freestyle quad with a naked GoPro. So let's see what we got here. We have here the HX115 carbon fiber from Betaflight. We're also going to use this 20 amps brushless all-in-one flight controller from Betaflight also. Again, most of this stuff that we're going to use is from Betaflight, so feel free to check their website and I'll link it to the description down below. And now for the brushless motors, we're going to use this 1204 5000 kV. This is meant for 4S batteries, so make sure you're picking the right kV for your batteries. Runcam Nano 2 for our FPV camera. And for the VTX, we're going to use the TBS Unify Pro V3. This is the 5V version, so don't put battery voltage to this VTX or else you will fry it. And of course, for the receiver, I'm going to use this TBS Crossfire Nano SE. This is basically with the Immortality, so yeah. This is TBS Triumph Pro for our VTX antenna. This is the UFL version. For our propeller, we're going to use this Betaflight X Gemfan 3016 3 blades. So this is 3" props. And of course, the DISON X GoPro mount. But before we start building, I just want to thank Rimsler and DISON Mini Cinewhoop group on Facebook. You can join the group if you want to. There's a lot of information about DISON stuff. And Rimsler also made a video on how to strip a GoPro. So if you're planning to strip your GoPro, go ahead and check his video. And I also want to thank the Naked GoPro Cinewhoop community. This is where I learned everything, from powering the GoPro to the flight controller, as well as doing the button mods where I'm able to press record without using the ribbon cable. A big shout out to Paul Park for his helpful informations. Now let's go ahead and build this thing. Let's start with the motors. Now unfortunately, this motors comes with this a little bit shorter screw. So if you're planning on building this, make sure that you have different length of M2 screws laying around. Now let's go ahead and mount these motors to the frame. Our frame is the glossy version, which is kinda cool. So this is a very good example why you need to have spare screws laying around, because as you can see, these are the screws included with the frame. Unfortunately, it's bendy, so we don't want to use that. We want to use the stiffer one, like the carbon steel or the stainless version of these M2 screws. You can buy a set of these screws on Banggood. I'll link it in the description down below. So after installing the screws, make sure to put this aluminum column. It will act as a standoff to your flight controller so that it won't touch with the carbon fiber frame. The next thing we're going to do is to put the rubber grommets to our flight controller. Now after that, it's always a good idea to test our flight controller if it's working on Betaflight before we solder everything to the pads, just to make sure that everything is working just fine. Now that we know that everything is working, let's go ahead and put our electronics together. First, let's start with the receiver. We're going to mount the receiver to the frame underneath the flight controller. So let's go ahead and do that. Once the receiver is mounted where we want it to be, don't forget to put the battery strap over the receiver or at the top of the receiver before you put the flight controller on it. I am saying this now because that was the mistake I did, which you will see what I'm talking about later on. For now, let's go ahead and solder the wires to our receiver. The black wire goes to ground, red wire goes to 5V, white wire goes to RX pad of our flight controller, yellow wire will go to the transmit pad of our flight controller or TX pad. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the receiver to the frame as well as the flight controller, and I'm going to eyeball the exact length of wire needed. Now after stripping the wires needed, I'm gonna go ahead and take the antenna and place it to the frame where I wanted it to be. You can place it anywhere you want, but for me this is the best place to put the antenna. Don't forget to put the heat shrink, and then after that we're going to put the double-sided tape. Now I'm going to tin the pads where I'm going to solder the receiver. After tinning the pad, let's go ahead and put the flight controller into the frame, and let's solder the wires. The black wire goes to ground, red wire goes to 5 volts, the yellow wire goes to TX1, and lastly the white wire goes to RX1. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tin the pads for our camera and for our VTX wires. After tinning those pads, I'm going to get the VTX and put the connector in, and I will cut the end of the other connector. Here you can see me tinning the wires before soldering to the pad. For the VTX, the black wire goes to ground, the red wire goes to 5 volts, the white wire goes to TX2, and then the yellow wire goes to video out. Next, I'm going to solder the camera wires. This time, the yellow wire goes to video in. The black wire goes to ground, and lastly, our red wire goes to 5 volts. And that's it. All we have to do now is solder the motor wires. Now you can use the plug they included with the motors, but I prefer soldering the wires to the flight controller. And we're almost done. The last thing I need to solder is the plug to power the GoPro. Now this plug will be connected to the battery lead. It will then supply battery voltage to the regulator, and the regulator will supply 5 volts to the GoPro. I don't want to use the 5 volts from the flight controller because it's not reliable, and it's always better to be safe. The regulator I'm going to use is the Pololu 5 volt 1 amp step down regulator. You can use the different brands like Maytech or whatever BEC you want to use, as long as it outputs 5 volts. This is what I'm talking about earlier. I have soldered everything, and then when I checked, I realized that the battery strap is not in place where it should be. So just double check everything and make sure that everything is in place. And now it's time to put the mount for our GoPro. It's very easy. You're just gonna put it in, and then yeah, just insert those cables and you're good to go. Just don't forget to put the nuts and the bolts and secure it in place. Now this nut is from the original GoPro. I just took it, and then I have the extra M5 screw. It's a little bit loose, so I 3D printed a small part to put inside the M5 screw, and then yeah. So this GoPro mount has a little bracket in front. That's basically for the FPV camera. You can just put it in there. After securing it in place, make sure to plug in your connectors and your camera should be working. For the VTX, I have to change the antenna, so I'm going to remove the heat shrink. And you can just pop off the antenna like this. Now I'm gonna go ahead and put my new antenna, and then I'm gonna run it like this, and I'm gonna put some black silicone glue to secure it in place and put some heat shrink. After that, I'm just going to use some double-sided tape, and I'm going to make sure that it's thick enough to prevent heat, because we're going to put this VTX at the 3D printed part right behind the GoPro. Now before plugging in the battery, I want to make sure that everything is fine. So I have my multimeter here in continuity mode, and I'm just going to make sure that I didn't ground anything. I didn't hear any beeps, so we should be good to go. Now everything looks good. Let's go and bind it and configure into Betaflight. As you can see here, I created a new model. I'm gonna hit page and then scroll up until I see the internal RF. I'm gonna turn it off, and then I'm gonna turn the external RF to crossfire. I'm gonna use TBS Agent X for binding, and then let's go ahead and set it up to Betaflight. Now that I plug in the USB, I'm gonna go ahead and click connect. Then I'm just gonna test the gyro, and yeah, all is fine, all is good. Let's go ahead and go to configuration. Here I'm seeing a reversed props, which is what I wanted, and I'm gonna go ahead and check the receiver. Make sure that it's on crossfire, serial base receiver, and then just scroll down and check what else we can check here. Now the correct motor pulse for this specific quad is 12, so I'm gonna go ahead and change that later. For now, I'm gonna save and reboot. Let's go ahead and hit connect again, and then go to receiver. Our receiver is soldered on TX1 and RX1, which is UART1 in our port stub. So we have to go there and turn on the serial RX on our UART1. Here you can see it's not turned on. So you have to switch it and then disable the TBS Smart Audio from UART1 and then change it to UART2, where we solder our VTX. Remember TX2, our receiver, that's where the VTX Smart Audio is gonna be. Now let's go ahead and save and reboot. and hit connect again. Now if we go to receiver again, our controller should be working, and it's working. Now if you look below, there's a little drone, and it should be following what your stick's doing, and if it's doing right, then you're on the right track. The next thing we have to check is our endpoints. As you can see, I'm checking the endpoints of every stick, and it always ends on 2011 and 988. It should be on 2000 and 1000, so let's go ahead and change that on CLI. Now that we're here on CLI, I'm going to type RX range and press enter. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to type RX range space 0 and then the number, which is 988 space 2011, and then press enter. But before that, I'm going to copy so that I can just copy paste it. And then now I'm going to change the 0 to 1, and then so on and so forth, and then hit save at the end. I'm typing the same RX range numbers because that's what the result of the endpoints when we checked earlier. It might be different from others, but that's what the result of mine, so yeah. Now let's go ahead and connect again and go to receiver and check our endpoints. It should be on 1000 and 2000. See, the throttle is on 1000, and then when I full throttle, it's on 2000, so all good. Now that I'm done with the receiver, I'm going to change the modes. I'm going to remove the angle and the horizon because I don't need it. I only fly acro. And I'm going to set up the arm on my auxiliary one. And my beeper is on aux 3. I'm just gonna move this right in the middle. Then for my flip over crash or turtle mode, it's on aux 3 but in the very end. So if I switch it to the middle, it's gonna beep, but if I switch it to the end, it's gonna be on turtle mode. And gonna hit save and go to motors. For the motors, make sure that your battery is connected and then your props is removed. Now I'm going to turn up master and I'm gonna check if every motors are spinning. And yeah, it's all spinning, and I have to check if it's spinning in the right direction. Now I'm gonna check the motor 1. It should be spinning counterclockwise. And it's correct. Next, motor 2 should be spinning clockwise. And I see it's not spinning correctly, so we're gonna have to change that later. Motor 3 should be spinning clockwise as well, which is correct. And lastly, motor 4 should be counterclockwise. And it's correct. 3 of the motors are spinning correctly except for the ESC number 2, which is the motor 2. So we have to change it. And there's 2 ways to change it. One is the hard way, which is to resolder and change the wires, exchange it, or use this BL Heli, which is the very easy way. Just gonna go ahead and connect the USB and then read setup, and we're just going to find the ESC number 2 and change it to reverse and right setup, and then disconnect. Now if we go to Betaflight again and check the motors, it should be spinning correctly. Now for the VTX, since we're running Betaflight 4.1.1, we have to download the VTX tables from the internet, because if we don't do it, we won't be able to use the smart audio. Here I'm just gonna type VTX tables, and I'm just gonna find Smart Audio 2.0, the USA version, so we're not restricted in some point. And I'm just gonna select all and copy. Now going back to Betaflight, I'm just gonna load from clipboard and it should be automatically appear. And I'm just gonna add one number of power levels because our VTX can go until 800 milliwatts. Now that our VTX tables are set up, we can just set up our bands, channels, and power where we want it to be. But for the power, we have to unlock the VTX first because right now we're only able to use the 25 milliwatts. Now after setting up, don't forget to press save. And now we're all done. All we have to do now is set up the OSD, but it's personal preference, so yeah, you can choose whatever you want. And now it's ready to fly, so let's go.